Hello and welcome back to my studio. It's Lois here from Lois and Morgana Davidson Art, and today I'm going to be showing you how I painted these storm clouds over the moors and mountains. I was inspired by this beautiful photograph that I found on Pixabay. I shall leave a link to this photograph in the description below. I won't be trying to paint it exactly. I'm going to be painting my loose interpretation of it, making a few changes. For example, I'm going to move that little bush along a little bit further into the painting, so it sits on about a third in, so it can be the focal point. And I'm also going to put a dry stone wall across on either side of that bush. I'm starting off with a very loose outline to start with in pencil, just mapping out the position of the mountains and the plains of land, and of course the foreground grasses and bushes that catch the light so nicely. I'm going to be painting wet in wet, and so I've chosen a really nice paper, Milford cold press watercolour paper. It's taped to my board, and my board's at an angle of about sort of 20 to 30 degrees, so gravity will help with the painting. I'm painting the sky first of all just with clean water and a large modeler brush, just trying to get a feel for the direction that I want for the clouds. I want to reserve an area of the white paper above the mountains so that I can paint that in with a nice clean glowing twilight or sort of sunset colour beneath the clouds. But to start with, I'm using Payne's Grey and Sepia to get in these really dark storm clouds, leaving gaps of unpainted paper, adding water here and there to thin the paint out, but keeping it nice and rich and nice and dark. Using the tips of my modeler, but changing pressure so I get thicker and thinner lines, just trying to sort of replicate those clouds. And as the paint sort of diffuses and mingles on the page, it should hopefully give me quite a nice moody sky. I can bring some of this paler grey colour over the mountains to get those started, and now hopefully you can see that nice gap of white paper that I've left that eventually will be my sunset glow in the distance on the horizon. Making sure I paint around that little bush, because I want that to have some nice bright colours. This will be my dry stone wall. I'm starting off getting it nice and dark because it'll be in shadow, so I don't need too much light stone showing. I'll paint it in nice and dark to start with, then put some details in right at the end. Just using the modeler brush so far. It's a really versatile brush, the same with a large flat brush or a haki brush, whichever brush you like, can be used for all these kinds of different brush strokes. It takes a bit of practice. You have to learn to control the water in these sorts of brushes because they hold a lot of water and paint, and if you're not careful you can sort of flood your painting or your palette with water if you don't keep an eye on how much water there is in your brush. So now I'm switching to the wet on dry method, and I'm applying really lovely rich raw sienna and burnt sienna to the foreground, and then I'll introduce a little bit of sap green, maybe some hooker's green, into the foreground as well, and start to build up that beautiful sort of all that bracken and sort of autumnal plants that have been lit up by the setting sun. Trying to keep texture, thinking about the direction of my brush strokes. All of this is really important when you're trying to sort of paint something in nothing or suggested detail. So All these are considerations as I apply the paint as loosely as I can to the foreground. And now just a little touch of lemon yellow introduced to the top of this little bush where it's just catching a bit more light. I can allow that to blend in with some of the other colours if it's looking a little bit cool. Just warm it up slightly with those other colours. And now, of course, my usual technique that I like, which is using a palette knife to scrape through that lovely rich paint to start me off with some grasses, tree trunks, branches, all those sorts of things, just suggested detail which I can paint into and over later on. But this just scrapes back through the paint and reveals the paper underneath, so I get those little highlights, and I can keep as many or as few of those at the end, but I'm putting in plenty to start with. Now swapping over to a mop brush and applying a mix of raw sienna with a touch of burnt sienna to that unpainted part now that the sky is dry, so I can keep that lovely glow above the mountains with this bank of cloud sort of towering over the top of it. I can bring a little bit of colour over the distant mountains as well, so that they are suffused with the reflected light from the sky. Then maybe a touch of colour a little bit higher up into the clouds, so they're just being touched by this light as well. And that's as much as I want to do to this first layer, so I'm going to leave it all to dry completely. Now that it's dry, I can paint into this foreground using the wet on dry method and using the nice dark sky colour made from Payne's Grey and Sepia, and paint between the marks that I scraped through the damp paint and around them, using this negative painting technique to add nice values and shadows into my foreground so that I get a bit of depth and distance in the foreground leading across the grasses to that little bush just on the edge of the dry stone wall. I'm using a number 14 or size 14 round brush for this. And now a nice rich layer of dark paint over the dry stone wall, and I'm sort of feathering out this dark mass of wall at the base so that I can negatively paint around the foreground and it looks like some sort of grasses and weeds sort of growing up around the base of the wall. So that's the deep shadows put into the wall to start that off. And now I'm going to paint in some of the distant mountains using some slightly lighter value and more sort of watery paint to get it a little bit paler, a little bit blurry, so that I can hopefully get some depth and distance into the painting. Adding texture by carefully scraping a few lines and marks into the distant mountains. Then working back in with a few more darks, maybe softening here and there. Again, this is my size 14 Escoda Perla synthetic round brush. It's got a lovely point and a really nice brush for these kind of wet on dry details. I'm just going to bring that dark colour down a little bit further into the grasses at the base of the wall. And now I'm going to remove the tape and have a quick look at it. The dry stone wall is nearly ready for me to use the palette knife to create the stone shapes. But I want to have just a quick look at it without the tape first. That gives me the chance to look at it with fresh eyes and sort of see how much variety and texture I need in the wall to bring the painting together. And it's just going to be a few little suggestions of stones, I think, but just going to knock back a few of those etched marks in the mountains. They're a little bit harsh. They didn't soften out as much as I expected them to, so I can soften them back with the brush. So just minor adjustments here and there. And now just applying a little bit of fresh wet paint, maybe slightly brighter across the wall, and that gives me something more to scrape in to. When I use the palette knife to scrape back the paint, it'll push the slightly brighter paint or darker paint around the edges of the scraped mark, so that I will then get the impression of little rows of uneven stones. This side of the wall, of course, is in really deep shadow, which is why the grasses and the bush stands out so beautifully against it. So I'm trying to make sure that these marks are subtle, but that it leaves you in no doubt that this is in fact a stone wall. And now a bit of that lovely dark tone over the bush, just over the right side of it to balance up the shadows, and then using the palette knife to scrape back to those beautiful bright colours, bringing them back but keeping the shadow now, which adds depth and distance and suggested detail to the foreground. So I'm going to call that finished now, and I must say I'm really pleased with the depth of colour that I've got in the foreground. I think the contrast of the dual bright grasses in front of the stone wall that's in deep shadow, and then of course the mountains that go back into the distance, and finally the stormy sky with that lovely orange glow above the horizon works really nicely to produce a very dramatic painting. Well, I hope you enjoyed that and found something of use here that you can take back and use in your own painting practice. Please leave us a like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And thank you so much to everyone who supports us on Patreon. We really do appreciate you. Well, I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.